The wind was a predator, clawing at the log walls of the cabin with a relentless, shrieking fury. It found every chink, every flaw in the home Thomas had built, and drove daggers of cold deep into the single room Alara now inhabited alone. Outside, the world had vanished, consumed by a churning vortex of white. The Wyoming Territory in the heart of winter was not a place for mercy, and for a widow whose husband lay buried under that same snow, it was a tomb in waiting. Grief was a cold stone in her belly, a permanent ache that the blizzard only seemed to amplify, mirroring the utter desolation of her spirit. The town of Redemption, a day's ride away in good weather, had already passed its judgment. They saw her as a fragile thing, a pity, an inconvenience. Gideon Thorne, whose ranch bordered her small plot of land, saw her as an opportunity. His offers to buy her out, couched in false sympathy, were a constant, grating reminder of her vulnerability. She had refused, clinging to this last piece of Thomas, this cabin filled with the ghosts of a life that had been stolen from her. Now, as the fire sputtered and the last of her stacked wood dwindled, a chilling thought took root. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was only delaying the inevitable. She pulled her worn shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the flames dancing a desperate ballet in the hearth. Each gust of wind sounded like a mournful cry, and she found herself listening for Thomas's voice in it, for the reassuring timbre that had always made the world feel safe. But there was only the storm, vast and indifferent. Her thoughts turned inward, a familiar, punishing cycle of what-ifs and if-onlys. If only she had insisted he see the doctor sooner. If only she had been stronger. The silence within the cabin was as profound as the tempest outside, a heavy blanket woven with loneliness and fear. It was in this profound solitude that the sound first registered, so alien and unexpected that she dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a log shifting in the fire. A sharp, percussive thud against the heavy oak door. It came again, harder this time, a sound of desperate intention that cut through the gale's howl. Fear, cold and immediate, seized her. No one would be out in this. Not Thorne's men, not a lost traveler. It was impossible. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She remembered Thomas's rifle, resting on its pegs above the mantelpiece, its cold steel a stark and terrifying comfort. She rose, her movements stiff, and took it down. The weight of it was unfamiliar, wrong in her hands. She crept to the door, peering through the small, grimy peephole Thomas had drilled. All she could see was a maelstrom of snow, but pressed against the wood was a shape, a hulking silhouette of a man, his form nearly lost to the blizzard. He was not alone. In his arms he held a smaller, bundled figure. He swayed on his feet, a titan on the verge of collapse. For a long moment, Alara did nothing, her mind a warren of panicked thoughts. A stranger.
À danger.
The town's warnings about drifters and desperate men echoed in her ears. But then the figure slumped, his shoulder hitting the door with a dull, final-sounding thud, and through the wind's scream, she thought she heard a faint, piteous sound from the bundle he carried. It was the sound of a child. Compassion, a force she thought had been frozen within her, cracked through the ice of her fear. This was not a predator at her door. It was a man and a child at the mercy of the storm that was also trying to claim her. Her survival and theirs were suddenly, inexplicably, intertwined. Her hand trembled as she slid the heavy bolt. The rifle remained in her other hand, a silent testament to her lingering terror, but she was opening the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it back against the interior wall with a deafening crash. The man stumbled across the threshold, a creature of ice and exhaustion, and collapsed onto the floorboards, shielding the small body with his own as he fell. The blizzard roared into the cabin, a possessive beast reclaiming its prey, but Alara was already fighting back, shoving her shoulder against the door, putting all her weight into forcing it shut against the storm, the bolt sliding home with a sound of grim finality. The room was suddenly, shockingly quiet, save for the crackling fire and the ragged, hoarse breaths of the man lying at her feet. He was formidable even in collapse, broad-shouldered and weathered, with a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun and wind. His hat had fallen away, revealing dark, snow-dusted hair. But it was the child that held her gaze. The man's arms were wrapped around a small boy, no older than 6 or 7, whose face was pale and still, his eyes closed. A crude wooden brace was strapped to one of his legs, visible where the blanket had fallen away. Without a word, without a thought beyond the immediate, primal need before her, Elara set the rifle aside. She knelt, her hands hovering hesitantly over the pair. The man stirred, his eyes cracking open. They were a startling gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled not with menace, but with a plea so profound it needed no words. He made a faint gesture toward the boy. Elara understood. She gently worked to unwrap the child from the stiff, frozen blankets, her fingers clumsy with cold and apprehension. The boy's skin was like ice. She gathered him up, his small body terrifyingly light, and carried him to the hearth, laying him on the rag rug before the weak fire. She chafed his small hands, his cheeks, whispering wordless sounds of comfort that were more for herself than for him. The man had pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the wall, watching her every move with an intensity that was both unnerving and deeply weary. He did not speak. He did not have to. In the silent, flickering light of the cabin, a fragile, unspoken pact was made. They were 3 souls, trapped by the storm, bound by the fundamental need for shelter and warmth, strangers sharing a silence that was deeper than words. The days that followed were measured not by the sun, which remained hidden behind a permanent veil of gray, but by the rhythm of survival. The blizzard raged on, a constant, howling reminder of their confinement. The cabin, once a vessel for Elara's solitary grief, became a shared space of quiet, intense observation. The man, who remained nameless as she did, recovered his strength quickly. His name was a question she never asked. Her own was a fact she never offered. Words felt like an intrusion, a fragile currency in a world that had been reduced to the essentials. Fire, food, shelter. He communicated through action. On the second morning, he rose before her, the faint light revealing his silhouette as he methodically checked the seals around the door and the single window, stuffing small strips of cloth from his saddlebag into the cracks where the wind whistled through. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in harsh conditions, his competence a silent, reassuring presence. He found her dwindling woodpile and, with a nod towards her axe, spent hours splitting the remaining logs into smaller, more efficient pieces that would burn slower, last longer. Elara watched him, a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension churning within her. His hands, though calloused and scarred, were careful. When he tended the fire, he did so with a focused patience, as if the flames themselves were something to be understood and respected, not just used. His name, she learned, was Silas, and the boy was Caleb. The names came not from a formal introduction, but from the quiet murmurings of the father to his son. Silas would sit by the boy's pallet near the fire, speaking in a low, gentle voice that was a startling contrast to his rugged appearance. He would run a hand over Caleb's forehead, adjust his blankets, or simply sit and watch him sleep. It was in these moments that Elara saw past the stoic stranger to the core of the man. She saw a profound, bone-deep tenderness, a protective love that was fierce and absolute. She learned about Caleb not through questions, but through observation. The boy was quiet and watchful, his large, solemn eyes following her as she moved about the cabin. His braced leg kept him mostly still, but he did not complain. He had a small, crudely carved wooden horse that he held constantly, its surface worn smooth by the ceaseless motion of his thumb. One afternoon, while Silas was outside in a brief lull in the wind, attempting to clear a path to the woodpile, Caleb dropped the horse. It rolled just out of his reach. He struggled to get it, his face tight with frustration, but the brace was too restrictive. Elara, who had been kneading bread dough, her hands white with flour, crossed the room and picked it up. She held it out to him. His small hand shot out to take it, his fingers brushing hers. His eyes, the same piercing gray as his father's, met hers for a fleeting second, a flicker of trust in their depths. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It felt more significant than an hour of conversation. Her cabin was small, and their shared existence forced an intimacy that was both uncomfortable and strangely comforting. She learned the sound of Silas's breathing as he slept on the floor near the door, a steady, rhythmic presence against the chaos of the storm. He, in turn, must have learned the small sounds of her grief, the quiet sigh in the dead of night, the way she would sometimes pause and stare at the empty chair where Thomas used to sit. He never acknowledged it, yet she felt his awareness. It was in the way he would add a log to the fire just as it began to die, or the time he wordlessly took the heavy water bucket from her hands as she struggled in from the well. These were gestures of quiet support, a recognition of her burden without the clumsiness of pity. One evening, the silence was broken by a faint, tinny melody. Alara looked up from her mending. Silas was sitting at her small table, his large hands carefully manipulating the inner workings of a small, tarnished music box. Thomas's music box. It had been a wedding gift, and it had stopped working months before he died. She had tried to fix it, but its delicate machinery was a mystery to her. She had simply left it on the shelf, another broken piece of her past. Now, under Silas's patient fingers, a hesitant, fragile tune emerged. It was the melody of their wedding song. Her breath caught in her throat. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sudden. She looked at Silas, but he was not looking at her. His entire focus was on the small, intricate device in his hands, his expression one of pure concentration. He was not performing for her. He was simply mending something that was broken. When the melody played through, clear and true, he closed the lid gently and placed it back on the shelf, his movements precise and deliberate. He looked at her then, a brief, questioning glance. Alara could not speak. She simply nodded, a single, deep acknowledgement of the gift. In that moment, he had not just fixed a music box. He had reached into her grief and restored a small, beautiful piece of her memory, handling it with a reverence she had not known a stranger could possess. The blizzard broke on the 5th day, the wind's shriek softening to a weary moan. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the grimy window pane, illuminating a world transformed. The snow was piled in immense, sculpted drifts, burying fences and turning the familiar landscape into a pristine, alien terrain. The immediate threat of the storm had passed, but they were far from safe. They were entombed in snow, the path to town impassable, their isolation now a matter of geography rather than weather. Their food supplies, already meager, were now a source of silent, gnawing anxiety. Alara took stock of her larder. A half sack of flour, a few potatoes, some dried beans, and salted pork. It was not enough. Not for 3 people for an unknown number of days. She saw Silas's gaze follow hers, saw the same calculation in his winter-gray eyes. The unspoken pact of the storm now shifted to a pact of survival. He spent the next day laboriously digging a path from the cabin to the small barn, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The sheer physical effort was immense, but he worked with a steady, relentless rhythm that seemed to defy exhaustion. Alara watched from the doorway, nursing a cup of weak tea, a feeling of helplessness washing over her. She was dependent on this stranger's strength. It was a humbling, frightening realization. That night, a new sound intruded upon the silence. The distant, hungry cry of wolves. The pack was close, drawn by the stillness after the storm and the scent of livestock from her barn. Caleb, who had been dozing by the fire, whimpered in his sleep, his small hand clutching his wooden horse. Silas, who had been cleaning Thomas's rifle with a quiet efficiency that told Alara he was far more familiar with it than she was, stilled his hands. His eyes met hers across the small room, and in them, she saw a flicker of the same cold fear she felt. The world outside the cabin walls was not empty. It was waiting. The next day brought a new crisis. Caleb woke with a fever. His skin was hot and dry, his breathing shallow. He was listless, his usual solemn watchfulness replaced by a glassy, vacant stare. Silas's composure, the stoic calm that had been his armor, finally cracked. Alara saw the raw fear in his eyes as he knelt by his son, his large hand resting on the boy's forehead, looking so immense and clumsy against the child's fragile brow. "He needs a doctor," Silas said, his voice a low, rough rasp. It was one of the few full sentences he had spoken to her. "The trail is impassable," Alara replied softly, stating the obvious, terrible truth. "It will be for days." A look of pure despair settled on Silas's face. He looked trapped, a powerful man rendered impotent by circumstance. Alara felt a surge of something. Not pity, but a fierce, protective resolve. She would not let this child be another loss claimed by this unforgiving land. "There are herbs," she said, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. "My mother taught me, for fever, willow bark and yarrow." She bundled herself against the cold and went to the small pantry where her dried herbs hung in fragrant bunches. She worked with purpose, crushing the bark and steeping the herbs, the familiar ritual a comfort in the face of Silas's mounting panic. He watched her, his hope and fear a tangible presence in the room. When the tea was ready, she carried it to Caleb. She sat on the floor, lifted the boy's head into her lap, and patiently coaxed the bitter liquid past his lips, a spoonful at a time. Silas knelt opposite her, his hands clenched into fists, his helplessness a stark, painful thing to witness. For hours they kept a silent vigil. Alara bathed Caleb's face with cool water while Silas held his hand, murmuring quiet words of encouragement. As dusk painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of purple and gray, the fever broke. The sweat beaded on Caleb's forehead, his breathing deepened, and the tension in his small body eased. He slept, a deep and natural sleep this time. Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding all day. He looked at Alara, his gray eyes shimmering with an emotion so raw and powerful it made her look away. "Thank you," he whispered. The words were simple, but they held the weight of his world. They were a confession of his fear, an admission of his debt, and an offering of profound gratitude. The barrier of their shared silence had been irrevocably breached, replaced by a connection forged in the crucible of near tragedy. They were no longer just a man, a woman, and a child. They were three people who had faced down the wilderness, and each other, and had chosen to trust. The fragile peace, however, was not destined to last. 2 days later, a rider appeared, a dark figure stark against the blinding white of the snow. It was Gideon Thorne. He reined in his horse before the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the dugout path, the smoke curling from the chimney, with a look of possessive appraisal. Alara's stomach tightened. Thorne dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow, his presence an immediate violation of the sanctuary her home had become. "Alara," he said, his voice oozing a condescending sympathy that set her teeth on edge. "I came to see if you had survived." The whole town was worried it was a lie, and they both knew it. He was here to see if the storm had done his work for him. His eyes flickered to the cabin door as Silas stepped out, moving to stand silently beside her. Thorne's expression tightened, his gaze narrowing as he took in the stranger's imposing frame. "And who is this?" he asked, his tone shifting from false concern to open suspicion. "A traveler," Alara said, her voice steady. He and his son were caught in the storm. Thorne's lips curled into a sneer. "Harboring drifters, are we? A lone woman like yourself. It isn't proper. It isn't safe." His eyes raked over Silas, dismissing him as a worthless vagrant. Silas said nothing. He simply stood there, a granite wall of silent opposition, his stillness more intimidating than any threat. His presence at her back gave Alara a courage she had not known before. "I am perfectly safe, Mr. Thorne," she said, her chin held high. "Thank you for your concern." Thorne's face darkened with anger at her dismissal. He lingered for a moment, his gaze promising future trouble, before turning abruptly, mounting his horse and riding away. The threat was no longer a distant howl in the night. It had a name and a face, and it had seen them together. The thaw came slowly, grudgingly. The world wept, snow melting in trickles that turned the paths to thick, clinging mud. The immediate danger of starvation and cold had receded, but a new tension had taken its place, left in the wake of Gideon Thorne's visit. His shadow lingered over the cabin, a promise of the judgment that awaited them in the town of redemption. Alara found herself dreading the day the trail would be clear. The silent world she had shared with Silas and Caleb had become a strange sort of home, a place where she was judged not by her status as a widow, but by her actions, her resilience. Here, she was not a pity case. She was a partner in survival. She saw the same reluctance in Silas. He grew quieter, more pensive, as the sounds of the world returned. He would often stand in the doorway, gazing towards the distant mountains, his expression troubled. The peace they had found in their isolation was a fragile bubble, and they both knew it was about to burst. The day came on a Tuesday. The mud had hardened enough for travel, and the sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The air was still cold, but it carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the scent of a world reawakening. "We should go," Silas said that morning. It was not a question. The finality in his tone felt like a stone dropping into a quiet pool. As they prepared to leave, a grim procession appeared on the horizon. 3 riders with Gideon Thorne at their head. Alara's heart sank. He hadn't waited for her to come to town. He had brought the town's judgment to her. He was flanked by 2 grim-faced men she recognized as his ranch hands, their expressions hard and unforgiving. They reined in their horses, forming a semicircle before the cabin, effectively trapping them. "Alara," Thorne began, his voice booming with self-righteous authority. "I had hoped you would see reason, but I see this vagrant is still with you." He spat the word vagrant, as if it were poison. "The town council is concerned. It is improper for you to be living out here alone, especially with a man of unknown character. For your own protection, we've come to escort you to town. Your land will be held in trust, of course." "My land is not your concern," Alara said, her voice shaking slightly, but she stood her ground. Caleb, who had been sitting on the cabin step, retreated behind her, his small hand clutching the back of her dress. "It is my concern when your behavior reflects poorly on us all," Thorne sneered. "You will come with us. And he," Thorne jerked his chin toward Silas, "will be dealt with for trespassing and vagrancy." The 2 men with him shifted, their hands moving towards the pistols at their hips. This was it, the moment she had feared, the moment her small, defiant world would be shattered by greed and prejudice. She had expected to feel terror, the same paralyzing fear that had haunted her for months. Instead, a cold, hard anger took its place. An anger born of the injustices she had endured, of the memory of Thomas's struggle, of the quiet dignity she had reclaimed within these 4 walls. But before she could speak, Silas stepped forward. He moved not with aggression, but with a weary, unassailable calm. He placed himself between her and Thorne's men, a silent shield. "The lady has told you to leave her property," Silas said, his voice low and even, yet it carried an authority that made the air crackle. Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who are you to tell me anything? A nameless drifter with a crippled whelp. You have no say here." Silas's gaze did not waver. He looked at Thorne, then at the 2 men beside him, his gray eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "My name," he said, the words falling into the sudden silence with deliberate weight, "is Silas Mercer. And as of a proclamation signed by the territorial governor 2 months ago, I am the new mayor of Redemption." A stunned silence fell over the yard. Thorne's sneer froze on his face, his complexion turning a pasty white. The 2 men beside him exchanged confused, panicked glances. "Liar," Thorne stammered, but the conviction had gone from his voice. "I was on my way to town when the storm hit," Silas continued, his voice unrelenting. "I decided it might be instructive to see the character of its people before they knew who I was. And you, Mr. Thorne, have been very instructive." He took a step forward, and for the first time, Thorne's horse shied back, sensing the shift in power. Your predatory lending, your land grabs from widows and struggling homesteaders. These practices are over. The governor has received numerous complaints. That is why I am here. This woman's property is hers. You will leave it and her alone. And your books will be the first official business I attend to when I reach my office. Thorn was speechless, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked from Silas's implacable face to Alara, who stood watching, her own shock slowly giving way to a dawning, incredulous understanding. The stoic, quiet man who had fixed her music box and saved her from the wolves was not a vagrant. He was the law. Without another word, Thorn yanked on his reins, wheeling his horse around so violently it reared. He and his men galloped away, their retreat a cloud of churned mud and humiliation. The sudden quiet they left behind was profound. The yard felt immense, the world stretching out before them, no longer a threat but a possibility. Alara looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time. The quiet competence, the innate authority, the deep well of decency. It all made sense now. He was not just a capable man. He was a leader haunted not by poverty but by purpose. He turned to face her, the hard mask of the mayor dissolving, leaving only the weary, gentle man she had come to know. "I'm sorry," he said. "I never meant to deceive you. I needed to understand what I was walking into. I needed to see the town for what it was, not what it pretended to be." Alara shook her head, a slow smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "You didn't deceive me, Silas," she said softly. "I saw who you were." He had shown her through his care for Caleb, his respect for her home, his silent acts of kindness. His title was irrelevant to the truth of his character. Caleb, sensing the danger had passed, stepped out from behind her. He walked on his braced leg to a small pile of kindling and picked up something he had been working on during the long days inside. He held it out to her. It was a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The simple beauty was breathtaking. Alara knelt and took it, her fingers closing around the smooth, warm wood. She looked from the gift to the boy and then to his father. In the quiet cabin, surrounded by the storm, they had become more than just survivors. They had become a family, forged not of blood, but of shared hardship and unspoken understanding. The future was still an unwritten page. The town of redemption and its judgments still lay ahead. But as she stood there, with Silas Mercer at her side and the small wooden bird resting in her palm, Alara knew she would not be facing it alone. The silence of her grief had been broken, not by words, but by the steady, resilient heartbeat of a new beginning.